Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to the APS's last virtual discussion of 2020. It's been quite a year, hasn't it? We appreciate you joining us throughout for so many fascinating presentations and conversations. Today's talk with Hannah Turner on her new book, Cataloging Culture, Histories of Documentation in an Ethnographic Museum, promises to be no exception. I just want to draw your attention to one more event that might be of interest, which we have coming up next week. It's on Wednesday, December 16th, and it's the launch of our new virtual tour for the exhibition, Dr. Franklin, Citizen Science. So 1 p.m. back here, join us if you can. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn the event over to Brian Carpenter, the APS's Curator of Native American Materials. Brian's going to introduce our speaker today, and he'll moderate the Q&A. Thanks so much for being with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Carpenter. I am the Curator of Native American Materials here at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome today to today's virtual discussion with Hannah Turner on her new book, Cataloging Culture, Histories of Documentation in an Ethnographic Museum. I'm very glad that so many of you could join us today. To begin, we want to acknowledge that the American Philosophical Society resides in Lenapehoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. For those of you joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and to public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check out our website, amphlsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news on forthcoming events. We're very glad to be hosting this talk today, as it intersects with a lot of the work we do at our Center for Native American and Indigenous Research here at the APS, much of which involves reckoning with the history of the colonial histories of ethnographic collection, cataloging, understanding the histories of those records and how they're described, curated over time and used in the present day. So this talk will be very informative to all of us here as well. A little bit about how we're doing this today. We're using the Zoom webinar. So don't worry, everyone, you have all been muted. If you do have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom center of your navigation bar. You can type there your question at any time. So if you have one early, feel free to put it in there early. There will be time at the end of the panel for questions with our speaker. And we're excited also to offer closed captioning today for the virtual discussion. If you'd like to use it, the closed captioning during the panel, please click on the CC box on the bottom navigation bar of Zoom. It's there on the right of the Q&A button. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Hannah Turner. Dr. Turner is an assistant professor in the School of Information at the University of British Columbia, where she researches and teaches about the connection between material culture and documentation technologies. She has examined systems of classification and categorization in museum ethnographic collections and looks at the development of bureaucratic record keeping in museums. She also examines how new digital technologies are used to represent tangible and intangible cultural heritage. She has taught at the University of Leicester in the School of Museum Studies from 2018 to 2019 and received her PhD in Information Studies from the University of Toronto. And with that, I'm very happy to hand it over to Hannah for her talk today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Brian and Kyle and Adriana. I feel very humbled to have been invited to give this talk. And I would first like to say that I'm a settler scholar of Norwegian, German, and British descent. And I am sitting today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people in the land now known as Vancouver. And this is the land upon which I have the privilege to work and live. I also want to note that today there will be just a little bit of discussion about ancestor remains and the removal of ancestor remains, but there are no images of remains in the talk, so I'll just let everyone know. So this talk today and my book traces the ordering and cataloging of material culture as evidence, and I will now share my screen because that is probably important. One moment. Okay, this talk in my book traces the ordering and cataloging of material culture as evidence in the scientific pursuit of the study of humankind, from the physical records of the 1800s in museums until the digital databases we know and struggle with occasionally today. I argue that critical scholarly attention be turned toward the mundane practices of record keeping in institutions, as I see them to be tied to the colonial legacies of data within which we are all moored. In the book, I trace the development of the standards of descriptions at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, and from the establishment of field collecting guides in the 19th century to the use of ledger recording books, to the development of organized information classifications, the card catalog, and eventually the computerized index and modern database. So I argue that these are media forms, and they are present in many bureaucracies around the world, but have both durable and performative qualities that render the objectivities of colonialism both present and invisible within the record-keeping practices of the institution, and that this has importance today. So today I want to present an overview of the book, really, and look carefully at how museum records are often taken to be neutral or privileged sources of knowledge. Doing reparative work in museums, especially concerning the repatriation of Indigenous belongings and heritage, requires a lot of paperwork. It requires digging into archives and catalogs to establish claims of ownership and authenticity, and to do the work of reconnecting records with objects and ancestors. So today I'm going to start really with 3 images, and I'll just make sure this works. That demonstrate what I see as 3 different modes of ordering that I'll focus on today, and then take you through some of the history of record keeping in the Department of Anthropology at the Smithsonian. So the first image is from a storage area in the attic of the first building of the Smithsonian in the late 1880s, then called the United States National Museum. If you look closely, you can see piles of objects from around the world, ostensibly, filling the floor with masks and racks hung with might be tapa or weavings. In the background is a woman seated, and I'll point her out later if you can't see her yet. And this scene for me is a visualization of the move, or this impetus to move from chaos to order, a concern of early anthropology and ethnology and science at the time. In the late 19th century, museums really were the bureaucratic manifestation of this desire to organize the world in a way that made sense, where you could apply some explanatory logic to culture, and by extension, cultural heritage or material culture. Material objects were then recuperated as evidence in this scientific goal. So moving from chaos to order was a project primarily of an earlier natural sciences and Western Enlightenment science that other authors have traced much better than I. And here I think of Daston and Gallison's work on objectivity, and of course, Tony Bennett's work on museums and recent work as well. One of the arguments I make in the book is really that as ethnology became defined as a science, it required the trappings of science, right? Notebooks, observation books, and most importantly, just general documentation. Good evidence then. So what is seen as material culture, ethnographic specimens, as they were called, required good documentation. And this idea of the value of documentation is something I take up quite seriously in the book. So moving forward in time, this image is from 1920 and denotes, I think, the role of documents in producing and maintaining this explanatory logic of colonialism and the budding role of bureaucratic practice in the management of cultural heritage, particularly in the mid-20th century. It literally shows an often hidden side of the practice of anthropological work at the time, record keeping. And I just want to draw your attention here to the different kinds of record keeping happening in this image, with card catalogs, file folders, and then the large ledger book sitting on the table. Thirdly, I want today to examine this idea of something I talk about a lot in the book, of material durability, which is really an idea that comes from media theory, where ideas become durable in infrastructures, particularly in information infrastructures. Ideas then, too, can have material force. And as I argue in the book, the reproduction of cataloging information from the 19th and earlier 20th centuries directly into the computerized databases through naming and classification standards and the development of index terms had the effect of securing historical record-keeping practices as authoritative. So Tom here is cataloging squirrel specimens, but ethnographic specimens were cataloged in a similar way. And I see this practice as being integral to understanding how colonial categories and relations become embedded into documentation, and by extension into the knowledge infrastructure of the institution. What happens here is that mistakes or assumptions that had been cataloged and recorded a century earlier are being directly copied into a new form. And it's really the practice of this that I'm interested in. So for those of you who maybe don't know, I wanted to just give a tiny quick history of the Smithsonian and the Department of Anthropology there. The Smithsonian Institution, established in 1846 as an act of Congress, really to provide a national collection. And the original bequest was that of James Smithson. In the mid-19th century, the Smithsonian really transformed into the United States National Museum, and other collections were deposited there, primarily a lot of ethnographic collections. And eventually this would become the National Museum of Natural History. So around this time in North America, the field of ethnology was considered to be a budding science, and the collection of what we think of as ethnographic material culture was really happening across North America and the world, as it was in Europe and in other milieus. So this was happening, or collecting, was being really done by naturalists, geologists, and often military personnel who would travel the world and amass objects in this manner. So as ethnology was developing throughout this time, I'm returning to this image, it looked a little bit like this, right? Primarily it was an office job, and the work involved working up the collections that were sent into the institution. So part of the project I'm interested in is looking at how rooms like this crafted knowledges and imposed epistemologies that still undergird much of the field, and how we think about collecting and objectivity. And I believe an important part of undoing the authority that is readily given to institutions is thinking about these histories. So collections did not just appear on the ground in rooms like this. What is here is being predefined, or was predefined, in a number of ways. And I'll just draw your attention quickly as a side note to whoever is Miss Latham, who's sitting in the back, if you couldn't see her in the first picture. And I don't talk about this in this talk, but in the book a little bit, the work of documentation is primarily done by what are considered non-specialist workers and women clerk typists, or lady clerk typists. So if we want to address that in the questions, I'm happy to do that. Often invisible, like this image. So one of the ways that collections were amassed, and there's been a lot of scholarship on this, as many of you I'm sure here will know, but one of the ways is through what were called circulars, or lists of desired things. These are really meant to be easily distributable booklets that were common in the natural sciences at the time, that could be sent out on scientific expeditions, and that non-specialist collectors, like military men, for example, could use to make decisions about what to take back and what to leave behind. This is an example of one of the earliest Smithsonian circulars that I could find, which clearly defines the collection of remains of human races, civilized and uncivilized, alongside those of buffalo, muskox, and badgers. As time went on, other circulars were published and distributed, and collections were amassed at the institution. Many of these circulars pay special attention to the collection of indigenous bodies, and this is where the sort of discussion of ancestor remains begins. The very first slide, So for example, in 1861, a circular entitled Instructions Relative to the Ethnology and Philology of America by George Gibbs was published. The very first line of the circular solicits the collection of crania, and I quote, Among the first of the desiderata, desired things, of the Smithsonian is a full series of the skulls of the American Indians. The jealousy with which they guard the remains of their friends renders such a collection in most cases a difficult task. But there are others in which these objects can be procured without offense. The horrific ramifications of this cannot be understated, and perhaps it doesn't even bear repeating here, but the circular documents a trend that pervades many of the archival records from this time. Indigenous bodies seem to be part and parcel of the natural world, but also of special significance because these remains were particularly desired. What legacy has this left us? One that Jenny Reardon and Kim Tallbear proposed that sees Indigenous bodies and even DNA as property operationalized for capitalist expansion and control. Reading against the grain, though, we can also read small acts of resistance implicit in the documents like these, where here agency and resistance becomes framed as jealousy, where individuals are cast as having childlike emotions that serve only to upset their paternalistic collectors. Traces like these remind us that Indigenous peoples at the time were not passive recipients of colonial collecting policies, but actively engaged in power negotiations. Terms like jealousy and offense are colonially coded words used to delegitimize the power of entire communities, and it bears without saying, strategies still used today. So if you can imagine that the objects that were brought into the institution, in part inspired by these circulars or perhaps demanded by them, you can imagine the kinds of foundational collections that were being developed at the time. And the perspective of the people doing the record keeping was deeply embedded in this worldview. In this workroom, for example, this worldview was being documented into a system of practice that extends far beyond 1890. This is the workroom for Indian ethnology at the USNM. Objects then, collected in the field, needed good record keeping because otherwise the researcher would never be able to find them again. Attaching a label with a name and identifying information was basically the information practice of the museum at this time, and still today is somewhat similar. So this was done with labels and with the bureaucratic accounting device of the 19th century, ledger books. Curators saw this recording of specimens as integral to the knowledge about them. You could know an object and what it meant. You couldn't know an object and what it meant without having the information associated with it. And that's essentially what it looked like. So in the first example here is sort of the first example of a ledger book in the Department of Anthropology. We can see Japan, silk red is the first entry. And the headings of the book itself reflect this sort of natural historical approach. So the headings at the top are things like current number, original number, name, sex, locality, when collected, measurement, etc. In fact, you can see how the sex column would be something used for a bird specimen, for example, but it doesn't exactly fit with ethnographic collections. And here in this next example, you can see it perhaps more clearly with argillite model poles for which it was being used. So the column is almost never filled. Importantly, though, these were what Candace Green calls the trusted medium of the institution and of science at the time. Ledger books provided a kind of bureaucratic power to achieve a system whereby objects could be retrieved and used as transportable objects of knowledge, where before they had been unsorted in the storeroom of the institution. Without good documentation and proper classification within a system, objects could not then be used as evidence or properly authenticated. Despite this desire for order, there is often little to be found within the system. In fact, the mundane and repetitive nature of the work left much space for error and mistake, and resulted in interesting moments like the use of ditto marks as cataloging information, which you can see perhaps more clearly in this image. So this tension of good documentation and bad data is something I'll return to and is made very obvious when the institution decides to adopt the newest, coolest technology at the time, the card catalog. So in the ledger book, information is stored only by accession number, literally when an object was picked up off the floor out of a box and described into a ledger by a clerk typist, for example. Card catalogs were being used in the Smithsonian libraries at the turn of the 20th century. And Otis Mason, the curator of ethnology in the late 1800s, decided to apply this logic to the ethnographic collections to further systematize this knowledge. As he noted of the collection at the time, the objects could hardly be in worse confusion, quote. The card catalog would become the source of knowledge about the objects, and literally the source upon which all future authentications would depend, unquote. Consistency was the goal, but again, this was rarely achieved. So I'll just zoom forward for some other images of it sort of in use. The card catalog really was a system that was in place until the 60s and 70s, and arguably it still is today. As an information infrastructure, it held enormous power and was a key access point to the collections for almost the entire 20th century. So looking at the card catalog, and here's, I'm just zooming through time, we're back to George McCoy using it in his office. Looking at the card catalog as a technology, though, I think allows us to see how information transfer between forms occurred and how colonial data legacies maintain their durability in systems. Throughout the life of the system, staff found it completely frustrating, the card catalog, and the documentation needed to be consistently revised and honed. Typewritten cards were adopted in the 50s, likely, and this image shows the categories of information that were considered important. The fields would have been filled directly from the ledger books, and in some cases, collector's notes if they had them. However, they also show from this draft catalog the importance of the material of the technology itself, the typeface, the quality of the paper, which would improve one's ability to sort through by hand, and the space allotted for each field. The information that was included was quite simply the information that could fit on the format of the card. This logic, what we might call the affordances of this technology, extends as these cards were being digitized in the first digital information system of the museum, CELGIM. CELGIM, or self-generating master, was really the first of its kind. It was a punch card database system where a programmer crafted queries onto punch worksheets or punched paper, input these into the system, and then retrieve the information via pages and pages of lists. Computerizing the collections became the main goal of the institution during the 70s and 80s. It was really the earliest attempt at this in museum history. And a myriad of programs and issues arose when the data written on typed on catalog records had to be transferred or migrated to the computer system by hand. The inclusion of large amounts of information, in the computerized catalog system was not actually really viable, and excessive record sizes, it was seen, were going to be completely inefficient. So owing to technical difficulties and other constraints, including the restrictions placed on large amounts of data, the department needed to determine what constituted an indispensable minimum of information that the catalogs had to include. And I'll just zoom through. Here's Tom again using that punch card system for cataloging, and then another image looking at these printouts from CELGIM. So as staff computerized the records, some basic information units like object type, name, and donor were included from earlier records. However, these were often input by interns or non-specialist workers, and mistakes or guesses made in centuries past were directly copied into this new system. Computerization increased the need to begin to truly standardize terms in order to be able to sort object records in this simple search and find system. This was referred to as a universal museum cataloging problem, and the challenge of defining the information needs of the institution, in addition to the technical limitations imposed by data values and expensive servers, was paramount. Importantly, in a digital system, naming is key. Categories had to be consistent for the system to work. And because of the history of the institution and this lack of true standardization, this was difficult. The department used index terms to solve this problem, as I assume many other departments did as well, that were often based off of an object's name and cultural affiliation. And I think we can ask here, and perhaps we can talk about in the question period, how did the institution create the standard naming system, and upon which naming authorities did they rely? In some ways, in many cases, the tribal affiliation was based entirely off the Handbook of North American Indians and the HRAF, the Human Relation Area Files system at Yale. So in one respect, the motivation to standardize the ethnographic collections came out of an era dedicated to making computer systems work. In another, it grew out of an increasing and fundamental frustration with the systems of historical documentation that some staff members saw to be in complete crisis. Inputting data into a computer system was difficult for a few reasons. Many different terms were often used to describe objects, and there was no way to automatically detect which terms were synonyms for each other and which were distinct. Object names were ascribed by whoever had cataloged them historically, and the level and detail of description depended on the role of the individual and the availability of earlier documentation from ledgers and card catalogs. These index terms were really a kind of inductive thesaurus, terms chosen first by the collections management team and then passed on for curatorial review. Major headings were modeled on, or at the very least, compared with institutions like the Pitt Rivers Museum in the UK, but were influenced from many sources, and I mentioned a few earlier. And today, as many of us probably know, there's no formal North American standard for ethnological index terms in the true sense of that word. Naming is a world-building activity, and naming practices are central to how we imagine the iterative, mundane ways in which information, data, becomes knowledge. After nearly 160 years of ledger, books, card catalogs, and translations between media forms, much information about about the collections had been lost or was unverifiable. In the late 1980s, 89 and 90 respectively, two important pieces of legislation in the United States were passed: the National Museum of the American Indian Act and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, respectively. This legislation required federally funded institutions to create lists of all the material they had in their collections that could be repatriated or belonged to Indigenous groups. And this included listing objects by tribal affiliation. And it's a little bit more complex than that, but I'm just sort of simplifying for the purposes of this talk here. During this process, it became much more clear how much of the data was incomplete, or that included racist terminologies in lieu of correct tribal affiliations, for example, known as legacy data or bad data in the institution. It's data that's both offensive, but could also be missing, incorrect, and therefore bad. These sort of mistakes, or these issues, became all the more visible when collections information was made available online in the early 2000s. It is this documentation that is the foundation upon which repatriation claims are assessed. The historical legacy of the early cataloging practices is important to the institution in its efforts to demonstrate provenance and affiliation with a degree of certainty. Again, these are concepts that have been created by the museums themselves, which in the current legal framework is required in repatriation claims. Naming standardization is therefore supremely important, and the institution prioritized identifying misnomers in the documentation. And it was, as I've outlined here today, extremely limited. Throughout the process of fixing old names, many, quote, repatriation data related issues arose. And this is something that Margaret Bruchac talks about in her work. And I think the quote is relevant here in her book, Savage Kin, and I'll read it. She says, the NAGPRA and NMAIA object categories, sacred and or patrimonial and or funerary, are often determined not just through consultation, but through the chance preservation of contextual evidence. What rituals were enacted when those objects were in use? Who permitted that excavation? Where is the proof of tribal identity? Were those things personal property or national patrimony? Who decided then, and who decides now? When Native nations and museums disagree, museums retain the final say. With all of this in mind, it seems fair to ask if federal attempts to facilitate repatriation have actually restored respect for Indigenous patrimony writ large, or merely legislated respect for a few protected and museologically accepted categories of Indigenous materials. Today, repatriation at the Smithsonian involves detailed investigative research on behalf of both the community and the institution, and the Repatriation Office handles these requests. The historical information and the material technologies used to record this information have vital implications then. In some cases, the way that objects were originally documented impacts their ability to be considered for return. And if there are mistakes in documentation, the museum often holds this authoritative power over the process. Repatriation provides an example of the enduring legacy of routine work practices from a century and a half earlier, revealing the ethical dimensions and challenges raised when the information infrastructure becomes materially durable. Information recorded in catalogs and databases acts as a form of long-lived material institutional memory, or imagined differently, forgetting. Histories of acquisition, staff members' work practice, and the conventions of naming within Eurocentric worldviews leave their marks on the records of a museum and constitute what I call this invisible work of a colonial infrastructure. In this talk, and then in my book, I foreground the historical and social origins of what we tend to see as normal daily practice. For me, this project has evolved out of an interest to understand how colonial impulses to name and categorize become inscribed in federal collecting institutions, and what the ramifications of this might be. I hope what maybe you walk away with today, or if you read my book, is a desire for inquiry about the cabinets and records that organize, classify, and perform colonial legacies of data around the world. The last image then that you're seeing now is a drawer seated on a stool, posing for a picture. For me, this is an unusual but effective visualization of the goal of this work: to center technologies and practices that make up knowledge work in museums, and to begin to disentangle and make strange their assumed authority. With that, I will say thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. And I'll just leave my little pitch for my book.